Okay, so my name's Hunter White, and this is my video overview of my research during this June term. So I'm going to share my screen and pull out my research log and my rabbit hole. Okay, so I'm going to start out my research log, and my two main questions that I wanted to be answered through my research was I wanted to learn like how far, like what kind of like radical tactics that like suffragists would use, were willing to use during this, like the late in the 19 teens to get the amendment finally passed, and also wanted to like learn more about how much did World War One affect the suffrage movement at the time. And so my research first began with my first article from the suffragists, and it talked about the amendment as like a war measure during that time. And they're basically pro-suffragists at the time before World War One, when it was clear America was going to have to enter into the war. Um, they basically argued that women needed to have the right to vote, so they felt the same duty and pride to put forth the effort to into the war effort by making equipment and keeping the economy going and running while the men went to fight in the war. So that was their big argument, that women needed to have the right to vote and to put more urgency on it. So that's how World War One started to really, first again, has started to affect the suffrage movement, because it started to give a little bit more like urgency to it, it felt like, from pro suffragists at that time. This next article was just kind of, it didn't really have to do with like World War One or like how radical or the tactics they would use. It's just about how like in Ireland women had the right to vote at that time, and in Great Britain at that time as well. Women over the age of 30 had the right to vote, even though in the U.S. women of no age could really vote. National wise, there was no national law at that point. And so I looked up like women's suffrage during the Progressive Era, which is during the 19 teens, to learn more background and just how like the setting was during that time. And I learned from 1880 to 1910, in those 30 years, the women in the workforce rose from 2.6 million to 7.8 million. So the workforce basically tripled in size of the amount of women in it. And actually, I didn't know this beforehand, but in 1896, four states in the U.S. had already allowed women the right to vote in elections. And that was actually very interesting to me, because I didn't know that at the time before I found this. And also learned that not all women were for the suffrage movement. They were actually somewhere against it. They thought it wasn't womanly to be able to vote, and they thought it was all man. It was like a man's job to vote and run the government. So that was interesting. And also my next article, I kind of found to dig deeper into like how like the National Women's Party, who are really the ones behind, I learned through my other research and other articles I didn't put in here, but just from like reading, I found that they were like the main ones who like were behind like the radical, like I used to say radical tactics of like picketing and such and that kind of thing. And they also, besides that, they also led political campaigns against Democratic political candidates across the country to get them out of office, because the Democratic Party at the time was the majority party in Congress, and they were very much composed of anti-suffragists and were not for women having the right to vote at the time. And so by learning like about the National Women's Party, I looked them up on the Library of Congress to get like a better overview, because the Library of Congress was a very good resource for me. And the NWP was founded by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns in 1913. And their radical tactics of these, like how far, I learned how far they're willing to go. And they actually picketed the White House for months. And in some cases leading up to World War One, they were arrested and sent to prison. And during in time in prison to gather support for their movement, some of them even went on hunger strikes. They were willing to go on hunger strikes. And this led to them being force fed. Like this is, just imagine like you're in jail for the right to vote and you're like on a hunger strike. You're willing to like starve yourself, and then you're willing to have somebody else forcefully feed you. Like this open like kind of answered my question about how far they're willing to go to gain support for their movement. And this kind of number 4 you see right here, kind of I just reiterate that, like they were arrested, they were sent to prison, they were force fed. So they're willing to go through literal like punishment, like physical punishment, to gain attention and for the movement for what they believed in. So that part really answered my question about how far and how much they really wanted to go to make sure they got their amendment. So that was the big question. That was my first real question that was really answered. And in my next article that I found, really answered my second question: how much did World War One really affect the suffrage movement? My first article told me a little bit, like the beginning of it, but in this one it told me that actually a lot of suffragists, when World War I started, they dropped like kind of the suffrage movement and focused on the war effort because their mindset was like, if we don't have a country to live in to actually fight for suffrage, there's no point in suffrage because then we're not a free country anymore. So hundreds of thousands of women dropped what they're doing and went into work to support the war effort by building equipment, munitions, food, all kinds of things, uniforms, to support their men overseas and to make sure like we survived as a country because you never know what could happen during war. And because of this, women gained a lot of admiration, support from their work for the suffrage movement after World War I. So this kind of answered my second question of how World War I may have dropped, like for time for a couple of years, made women and suffragists kind of stop doing what they're doing to focus on war effort. But in the end, it gathered them much more support from not only people across the country, but also Woodrow Wilson, president at the time, announced his support in 1918 of the amendment, which later on caused in 1919 for the amendment to be passed through Congress and eventually signed in 1920. So that last article basically kind of answered my second question of how World War I really affected the suffrage movement. And so that was basically my two questions, how they were answered. And my rabbit hole was really just like me listing out my kind of research, like my research like basis I use. Like I use the suffragist newspaper, and this is like my question I read right here is want to learn more about the radical tactics suffragists used in the 1910s and how World War I also affected suffrage. And so that was like my main question right here. And I used Ancestry.com to learn about Alice Paul. I used the Library of Congress quite a bit for articles. I read more, but I only put the ones in like articles that really I felt like answered my questions and went along with what I was doing. And as you can see, BBC again, I put that in there because that was a very influential article. And also I learned more a little bit about Alice Paul and Lucy Burns because I was just interested about how they like started the NWP and since they're willing to go so far for it. And so that is my presentation. I'll stop sharing. And those are my two questions I had for this term and how they were answered. Thank you.